Welcome to Bloomberg's Davos debate. I'm Francine Lacroix, and we're talking China. Over the next 75 minutes, we ask, where is the Chinese economy headed? With the new five-year plan being presented in 2016, how can the world's second-largest economy shift gears without stalling its growth engine? And what does all the market volatility tell us about the perception of China and, of course, the task facing Chinese regulators? Well, we have, I'm very pleased to say, an A-star panel. Thank you so much for coming on. Zhang Jianxing, he's chairman of the board, Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. Christine Lagarde, managing director at the IMF. Fang Xinghai, Vice Chairman, China Securities Regulatory Commission, of course, Director General at the Intercontinental Economic Department. Gary Cohn, President at Goldman Sachs. Zhang Xing, of course, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder at Soho China. And Ray Dalio, Chairman and Chief Investment Officer at Bridgewater Associates. So thank you so much for joining us. Chairman Zhang, let me start off with you. China's markets, of course, have begun the year with a lot of volatility. What do you believe is the underlying cause of this?
这个我不认为就是中国的经济有波动，因为呢，从去年中国的经济的增长依然在原来的那么一个预测的一个范围之内，6.9%的一个增长，已经公布的所有的一些经济指标，我觉得都是表明了中国经济依然是世界经济增长的引擎去年对世界经济的增长的贡献差不多是1/4吧。那么呢，当然了，这个今年以来，这个中国的这个和世界一样，在市场的方面产生了有一些指标的波动。当然，产生的原因是非常的复杂的原因。那里面呢，有这个全球经济这些年的一个艰难的一个复苏就像那个进入了一个经济的一个平庸的一个增长时代那么另外呢，就是这个全球的货币政策的差异性扩大，美国的加息这个像欧元区、像日本这样的超级的这种宽松政策，也带动了这个市场的这种波动。大宗商品这2天大家看到大宗商品的价格的这个下行，股市、汇市的这种剧烈的波动，这已经变成一个全世界的一个新的情况。所以今年一开始就是一个波动之年所以我想呢，对于这些问题，这个里面有些是正常的因素，但有些是非正常的。这里面是有一些这个市场的一些恐慌的情绪在内。我想在当前，一个当然我们要继续这个全球的改革这个结构性的改革，要推动经济呢继续能够走出这个经济的低谷，能够持续的增长那么这是我觉得是一个最重要的一个基本面。第二呢，我觉得全世界的这个特别是监管者监管部门要共同努力，来防范这种市场的过度的波动所给经济带来的伤害。那我的意见就是这样。
Thank you so much, Chairman. Ray Dalio, is there something that the West misunderstands about Chinese markets? And does that, of course, exacerbate the volatility we saw over the last 2 weeks?
I think there's a lot that the West misunderstands about the Chinese markets, but I think the essence of what's going on in China is an adjustment, 4 major challenges. They have a debt restructuring challenge. They have an economic restructuring challenge, so they have to come up with a new model for the economy. They have a capital markets challenge, to build the capital markets in an efficient way so that it circulates capital through the system better. And right now they have also a balance of payments challenge, having to do with the pressure on the currency, the capital outflows, and those types of things. These are things that have happened repeatedly through the rest of the world. The United States has had 3 major debt crises. We couldn't pay our debts in 1971. We had it in 1982. We had a debt crisis. We had the S&L crisis. We've reshaped our economy many times. I remember when the steel industry ended and heavy manufacturing, and we've gone into other areas. We've had a number of balance of payments and currency issues. So I think that maybe one of the things that is being misunderstood is what is a normal balance of payments, economic, too much debt, restructuring kind of recession. In Japan, they used to define a recession as anything less than 3% growth. Maybe in China, they'll describe a recession as less than 5% growth. We're going through that. I think it's being confused with the longer-term picture. In other words, I think that the reforms that are going on in China and the leadership in China in terms of where it's moving is going to be very fundamentally good. And so you're looking at something that is a short-term challenge as distinct from something of where we will be in 5 years after the regeneration of new capital markets and new economy with vibrant young entrepreneurs and that other economy that's now beginning to flourish.
But why have we had so much volatility since the start of the year?
Well, the volatility has been primarily a result of, in the world as a whole, that we have an easing of monetary policy all around the world. And we're not going to have the same effectiveness in that easing of monetary policy. Because with interest rates at zero, you can't cut interest rates. And with asset prices having risen because of that quantitative easing, there is risk, the risk premiums have gone down, and there's a big vulnerability. So when China is dealing with the rest of the world, China is a negative on the margin for the rest of the world. And the world is vulnerable because of the lack of monetary policy, while asset prices are comparatively high.
Mr. Fang, how do you explain the volatility? Is it, something that we just need to learn to live with?
Well, maybe there are two factors that are going on. One is that China is in the midst of transiting from an economy relying heavily on investment and exports to an economy a lot more dependent on domestic consumption. And in this transition, a lot of assets get revalued in the process. So I think this is the primary reason lying behind volatility. Now, another factor is that the Fed raised interest rates not long ago. A lot of emerging markets didn't perform very well. Their domestic reforms got stalled. So you have a combination of Chinese transition plus international influx. And that caused volatilities. Now, you ask why a lot of volatilities right at the beginning of the year. Well, asset price adjustments usually went by steps, right? It does not go always smoothly. And we just hit that step at the beginning of this year.
Madame Lagarde, if you look at the fluctuation, what have we learned? Is there something that we have learned about what the Chinese are trying to do in the last 2 weeks?
At the IMF, we don't look at the last 2 weeks. So I'm a little bit embarrassed to comment on the last 2 weeks. If you don't mind, I'd like to just go back to more basics. It is a fact, as has been indicated, that the second or first, depending on how you calculate GDP, the second or first largest economy in the world is going through a list of transitions. Ray has indicated that, you have indicated that as well. Industry to service, export to consumption, lower level of investment, hopefully. And I think there's another one which is happening at the moment, which is also a governance change, which has begun, which is probably going to continue to roll out, which has to do with the anti-corruption fight that President Xi has highlighted as one of his key proposals, which has to sort of trickle all the way down to the provinces. And that is also a management change which has to be taken into account by Chinese authorities, Chinese operators, so that risk can be apprehended, risks can be taken in spite of this happening. I would say also that given those massive transitions that are undertaken pretty much at the same time and accepted as such, there is a communication issue, which, it's something that markets do not like. Uncertainty, not knowing exactly what the policy is, not knowing exactly against what the renminbi is going to be valued. Is it the dollar? Is it a basket of currencies? Which basket is it going to be? I think on the balance of payment and on the exchange rate matter, I think better and more communication would certainly serve that transition better. I tend to agree with Mr. Dalio's assessment, but from our perspective, we believe that all those changes are perfectly manageable if the right policies are taken and given the large amount of reserves, the large amount of buffers that the country has. So from our perspective, we are, forecasting a 6.5 growth rate for next year, and we believe that the Chinese authorities can perfectly legitimately accept that this growth rate is fine for China, just as it is fine for the exchange rate to be aligned with the basket of currencies.
Gary, does China actually need to decide whether they are a free market economy or not? Or have they decided but not communicated enough?
So look, I agree with everything our panelists have said so far. I mean, many of these fundamental transition points that China's going through are real. When you go from a capex economy where you're building infrastructure to an opex economy where you're basically having consumers drive your economy, that's a long transition. You cannot, monitor or affect consumer discretionary spending. It's called consumer discretionary spending. You can't affect it the way you can affect government spending. So this transition is difficult. On the specific question of China's economy and whether it's a market-based economy, clearly this is a question that the market as a whole is dealing with. There have been signs that China wants to have an open, free economy, an open, free marketplace. But in certain situations, the Chinese have intervened into their market, making it less than a free and open market. Now, I must remind everyone that many of the things that the Chinese have done in intervening in their market are the exact replicas that many other countries, including the United States, have done at certain parts in their modern history, not even in their old history, whether it be circuit breakers or restrictions on certain type of trading activity. So I agree with Madame Lagarde, who basically said, it's a communication issue. The communication is really what's important here. Communicating what the Chinese market is going to be and sticking with that theory, no matter how painful it is in the transition. Transitions are very difficult, and you've got to stick through the transition.
Zhang, how difficult is communication when you're dealing with such a huge and complex economy?
I come from the real economy side, being a real estate developer. So what I see is that there's a total decoupled between the stock market trading the stocks of the real estate developer, which is hugely discounted, and the real economy, where we see that the easing of the monetary policy is actually pushing the asset price up. And so that's on the one side. And also in terms of transition from investment-driven economy to consumption-driven economy, for real estate, it means that we used to build buildings. Today, we just manage the leasing. And in terms of leasing, actually is going quite well. At least in the cities I operate in, Beijing and Shanghai, we're seeing a massive take-up of new space from internet companies, mostly internet companies. We're seeing not so much new take-up from the old economy, like non-internet, traditional economy. But by and large, we have new buildings coming up to the market almost every other month, and they're all being taken up. We haven't seen a single building sitting there empty, not being taken up. So I think that there must be a communication issues, because on the one hand, the real economy seems to be doing okay, but on the other hand, the stock market is trading at a huge discount. And obviously, the investors are not getting the same message as we operating economy is doing.
Chairman Chen, again, to this point of transparency, what the markets understand. In 2013, China, of course, promised to give the market a decisive role in the economy. And then since we've had intervention in both the currency but also the stock market, when do you foresee China making good on its pledge?
这个中国呢，这个坚定的走市场的道路，这一点决心呢，这个已经向全世界都已经重申了啊。这个 市场呢讲在这个经济的这种配置中间要起到决定性的和基础性的这个作用。那么刚才讲到了，我也想讲一讲关于沟通的问题啊，这是确实是一个非常重要的问题。当我们这个经济在产生巨大变化的时候，有很多的方面，我觉得需要沟通。这个沟通就是一个您刚才说的一个透明度。那么实际上，中国的经济，在过去的几年中已经产生了非常大的变化。过去大家经常对中国提出，哎，你的投资比例太高啦，你这个投资驱动啊，你这个第二产业，这个你的第三产业应该发展啊，等等。其实，在去年的中国已经出现了这样的情况啊，这个消费已经对经济的这个推动已经达到了这个66%啊。刚才这个我们张欣女士讲到了这个房地产的市场，大家一方面看到了房地产的这一些的这个过剩啊，第二，去年房地产的实际的增长只占了这个固定资产投资的比重的10%左右。它对总的投资中间只增长1%，但是呢，房地产的这个消费这一块却增长得非常快。像工商银行，我举个例子，我们去年62%的新增贷款是用在以房地产个人按揭贷款为主的消费贷款，说明这个经济有巨大的强大这样的活力。但是所有的这一些变化，我觉得要加强沟通。现在的信息的这种不对称的情况依然是非常的严重，一些好的消息甚至会被解读为一些坏的消息，啊，有些消息呢，一些变化，大家还习惯于用一种旧常态的眼光或者这种分析来做。那么，所以呢，我想呢，对中国来说，在走向这一种新常态情况下面，加强沟通。对中国来说，我觉得是一个考验，怎么样能够更好的运用一种预期的管理，来事先来调节这个市场的一种变化。我想呢，中国会在这一些的波动中间，我们会学习到很多，将来也会越来越成熟的。
Yeah, I think there are three issues here. One is communication, as Christy just said. The other is that, is there a strategy, a real strategy, to transit from a investment-led economy to a consumption-led economy? The third issue is that some people question the execution of the strategy. Right? Now, volatilities by themselves should not be worrisome for people like Gary and Ray, who know volatility, and Chairman Jiang as well, right? They know volatilities very well. It's the three issues behind the volatilities that somehow have worried a lot of international investors. In terms of communication, you're right. We should do a better job, and we are learning, and we are doing it. I'm here today to communicate. But we have to be patient because our system is not structured in a way, right, that can communicate or is able to communicate seamlessly with the market. We are learning, right? And China can learn. Okay, I can assure you that. In terms of strategy, I think there is a strategy, and it's the right strategy, and that is to reduce investment, right? To expand consumption, to shift more income, from the state-owned sector to the pockets of consumers, and to do what we call supply-side structural reform. And the purpose of that reform is to make our supply side of the economy a lot more responsive to consumer demands. Because right now in China, it is not that consumers are not there. They are there. They are demanding a lot of goods and services, but the supply side of the economy is not providing them at a reasonable price. And healthcare, education, entertainment, high-quality consumer goods, you can point it to everything. So there it lies a lot of opportunity. Then execution. Now, is China really transiting from a investment-led economy to a consumer-led economy. I mean, if you read Martin Wolf yesterday in the Financial Times piece, Martin is a good friend of mine. He seems to be saying that China is not transiting at all. The economy still relies very much on investment for growth. Now, on that score, I disagree with him. Investment as a share of GDP is shrinking, and consumption, right, domestic consumption as a share of GDP is increasing. It reached 52.2%, 52.5% last year, and 5 years ago it was only 49%. Now, people say, oh my goodness, 3% shift is just not large enough. I agree. It could be faster, it could be bigger, but we are moving toward the right direction. And ultimately, when you look at a country and decide, your views about the country, you look at two things. One is the fundamentals, the economic fundamentals that the country has: saving, education, right? Hardworking, innovation, whatever. The other thing is you look at the leadership, right? If you have strong leadership, you have confidence in the country. If the country has weak leadership, despite very good economic fundamentals, the performance will not be good. And if you look at China's leadership, I think we have the strongest leadership in the world at this point.
Mr. Frank,
Period.
a question on regulation, and then I want to get to Ray and Dalyu. Last week, the chairman of China's stock regulator said there has been a staff exodus, and he was basically indicating that the department was having trouble keeping up with market sophistication. Is the market getting too complex for China to regulate properly? Because this is what people are concerned
I understand what you're saying. These are short-term challenges. China has the talent. I mean, you have so many people going to universities, going to graduate schools, going to good Chinese universities, going to good Western universities. We have the people. And government service, public service, still carries a very high esteem in China. So I have no doubt that we have the talent. The market, of course, has gotten a lot more complex, right? And sometimes, we don't know how to deal with the market very well yet. But, you bet, we can learn.
Gary?
So look, Francine, you started out talking about the whole question of volatility. And we morphed onto this discussion of communication and free markets. And I think these two concepts go together. And so when you look at what's going on in China and the Chinese trying to move to more of a free market and this inability to communicate more freely, that's somewhat where you're generating the volatility. The world standards today for publicly listed companies and publicly listed disclosure on balance sheets, audited financial statements, corporate governance is pretty high and getting higher everywhere in the world. People, investors, capital is fungible around the world. Capital moves at the speed of light today. People want access to Chinese companies. They want Chinese companies held to the same standards. Number two is they want the marketplace to determine which Chinese companies should have access to capital, not the Chinese themselves deciding which companies should have access to capital. So as the Chinese market opens up and becomes more freer, the marketplace will determine which Chinese companies should be public and which ones shouldn't be public. And to the extent you start getting more, world accepted financial statements, corporate governance, and the market determining which companies will be public and which companies won't be public, I think you will dampen volatility. So a little bit of this is just natural evolution and part of the communication problem as you're evolving a market real time. Unfortunately for the Chinese, they're doing this in 2014, 15, and 16 in a digital era. They're not doing this in the 1930s when we had a telegraphic era. The rest of the world did it in an analog world. They're doing it in a digital world. So we're watching it real time. They're also doing it in an era when we just got through re-regulating all of the financial institutions around the world, and we've taken an enormous amount of liquidity out of the markets, and the Chinese are suffering from this lack of liquidity that exists out there.
I think that the Chinese policymakers are not getting nearly as much credit as they deserve. And I have the benefit of seeing it from the outside, so I'm not speaking from a Chinese perspective. I think you have to get into the nitty-gritty of what they're going through. So let's say a debt restructuring. If you take a look at the debt restructuring that they're having to go through, just to put that in perspective, local government spending counts for about 30% of GDP. It's running a deficit, funding deficit, of about 20%. That means if you cut that funding deficit, that's about 6% of GDP, a hacking of 6% GDP. If you look at the way that that has been restructured and managed, it's been managed really superbly. It's a very difficult situation because you're in a situation where if you just restructure and you don't provide those capital, all of that spending that is taking place through there won't take place. So, and the same people who are doing that restructuring are the same people who did it in '98 with Zhurongji. They're the same experienced people. If you know the mechanisms, the type of mechanisms, literally to be using these things, they're pursuing that. If you look at the economic restructuring, in other words, they're going from one economy. Basically, it was like 5 banks, lends to state-owned enterprises, and lends to local governments. Okay, the development of a shadow lending system, that's been done with a lot of balance. Because, in other words, it's a risky situation, but the free exchange of capital in a certain way is getting capital to companies that never would have had access to capital before. And that's not producing a volatility. That's quite an accomplishment. And if you look at, okay, the balance of payments is a very difficult situation. Capital flows are what the capital flows are. And if you look at how they're handling it, I think in terms of the stock market handling it, there have been problems. And some of the responses have not been by world standards. But there was also a big order imbalance. In other words, when the order hit and everybody wants to sell, and then they have to respond quickly, there was that sort of circumstances. When I speak to those policymakers and I speak to those in the West, I find equal levels of, or even better sometimes, equal levels of competence in terms of dealing with the things that they're dealing with. I would say that if you compare also the politics of the government, there are no loose cannons that are going to be running China. I mean, these are people, if you look at the system of how it has to be chosen and how you get to there, you have to be a competent leader and devoted to the country. If you look at the politics in the West, and we look at some of the leadership there, that could be quite scary. So I think this commitment, the commitment to market reforms is a very real commitment to market reforms. In other words, and think of the power that that's going to have to liberalize that economy. Basically, it's been an economy with the money clogged at the top. Top 10% is where it's passing through. This will circulate, and there's a new China. You could speak to that new China, the new board, and the entrepreneurship. So I think we're going through a cyclical, you can't help but go over that cyclical adjustment. And that'll last probably maybe 2 or 3 years. It comes at a bad time for the rest of the world because when you look at its impact on commodity prices, and then not only just commodity prices, the other economies of Brazil and so on, and you look at the vulnerability of the rest of the world in terms of monetary policy, that's a bad combination. But we'll get past this, I think, in terms of China. A bad year in China is going to be a great year in almost any other country.
Madame Lagarde, do you question at all their commitment to structural reform, and what are the dangers if these structural reforms are not being pushed through?
We went through a couple of years of very intense discussions with the Chinese authorities because we were going to review the composition of the special drawing right basket of currencies, which defined the value of the special drawing rights, which is that sort of elusive currency of the IMF, which central banks around the world use. And, if you had asked me whether the Chinese authorities would actually complete the reforms that they had to undertake in order to satisfy the criteria of that freely usable currency, I would have said, I don't think so. Yet, when the authorities actually put their mind and are determined to develop a strategy, implement reforms, certainly we've seen in that particular case an absolute, I wouldn't say perfection, nothing is perfect in this world, but an unbelievable determination and ability to deliver what, frankly, many would have considered as undeliverable to begin with. So if the same determination is applied in relation to the reform of state-owned enterprises, for instance, in relation to the the clarity of messages concerning the transitions that are at play at the moment, clarity of communication concerning the macroeconomic framework within which they will define their policies going forward, even if the growth rate is not at 7-ish% and closer to anywhere between 6 and 6.5. I think that it will take a little bit of time, as was said earlier, but we believe that they will deliver. It's a massive undertaking, let's face it. And just reforming the state-owned enterprises is going to require a special fund allocated to dealing with the issues. They've done that in the past already with certain sectors, and I have no doubt that as it is part of the exercise, just like the supply-side reforms, that is the buzzword at the moment in Beijing, it will happen.
Chairman Zhang, there is commitment because last month we had a mysterious authoritative person quoted by the People's Daily saying that China must get used to the L-shaped recovery unless reform is pushed through. Now, what are the dangers of waiting too long?
这个改革对中国来说这个是一个没有退路的事情。因为中国要跨过这个中等收入的陷阱，必须要进行全面的和深刻的改革。那么现在这场改革呢，我觉得它是一个，我觉得可能会将来不仅影响中国10几亿人口，可能会对全球带来重大影响的一场改革。那么这个改革呢，你看中国的改革，它表面大家看到可能经济的增长速度是有一点下行到了这个6.9%，或者将来到6.5%，或者更高一点也有可能。但是更重要的是，从经济的增长来看，中国更重视经济增长的质量，而不是追求经济增长的一个数量。那么在经济增长的一个结构中间，要进行重大的改革。那么经济增长的驱动力，那么不再像过去这样简单的依靠投资和要素的驱动，要更多的依靠创新来驱动。在这一场改革中间会触动很多东西，像结构改革确实不是一件非常容易的事情。那么结构改革最近中国讲到了这个进行公给制的一些改革。那么这个改革我回复一下，刚才比如说讲投资负债率的问题那么这个里面的进行改革，中国其实我们现在的政府的负债率并不是非常高的包括我们地方政府的一些负债率。那么现在呢，这个地方政府的负债也开始采取了一些财政发债的办法，降低他们在银行的融资。像工商银行，我们政府平台的融资最近2年下降了40%，这一部分都转移为一些政府的一些债务更加的透明和公开化。那么个人的负债率其实中国是很低的中国还是偏低的。那这里面有很大的潜力，是中国经济一个增长的一个动力。中国比较有点问题需要解决的是企业负债率过高。像企业负债率过高的改革过程中间就是非常的艰难，你需要去库存、去杠杆去产能过剩。我们过去的像钢铁、水泥、电解铝以后很多的行业，都是在中国投资高速增长的时候，他们发展起来了。随着中国的增长的动力变化以后，这些产业产生了大量的过剩。那么你要去除这些过剩，这个过程中间是一个很痛苦的过程，你需要有成本。这里面无论是财政的成本、金融的成本，或者是其他的成本，这样才能实施转换。所以呢，我总的觉得中国呢是一场必须要进行的改革。尽管这场改革是非常的艰难，但是只有完成这项改革，才能使中国的经济有一个更加光辉的一个未来。
Thank you, Chairman. Ray, given the chairman's comments on debt, how concerned are you about an outright financial crisis, given the amount of leverage in China?
As was said, the leverage levels are not intolerably high. The problem is that debt is still growing at a rate that's significantly faster than income. That's an unsustainable circumstance. it's also an understandable circumstance because changing that rate abruptly will have a negative effect on the economy. I think the issue of instability is more of a balance of payments currency issue. That becomes one that I'm more concerned about. That might require more of an adjustment in the currency, and that adjustment in the currency would have an effect on the rest of the world, which would also transmit deflationary pressures to the rest of the world because those exchange rates would essentially appreciate. And that has an effect at a time when there is a weakness in the rest of the world. We have to look at the impact that China has on the rest of the world and the rest of the world has on China, and the fact that there's not much of an effectiveness in monetary policy. Those two things combined create for a risky situation.
There are a lot of issues that I can address in this short period of time, but let me pick two. One is that, Francine, when you mentioned the stock market volatility and then currency volatility at the start of this year, I would like to suggest that stock market volatility should not be something that people should be so concerned with, because even at today's level, which I was told the Shanghai stock market declined by about 2%, it's now standing at around 2,900. It's 40% down, from the peak, but it's still 30% up from a year and a half ago, and valuation is still very rich. And since the stock market is rather isolated from the outside world, the impact on the outside world is very minimal. Currency volatility is something, yes, you should pay attention to. And since Ms. Lagarde is here, I just would like to say a few words on that. China used to have what we call a clawing peg, right, against the US dollar. Now the stated goal is to move toward a basket approach. And that approach is a serious approach. It's not something that we just say, we do it now. People, when they look at the actual daily movement, they think, my goodness, what is the PBOC doing? Sometimes they kind of move back to clawing peg. I think this, you should not focus the central bank's strategy too much on just a few days movement. If you look at the strategy over a period of, say, half a year or a year, you will realize that moving toward the basket approach is the decided policy of China. Now, the RMB appreciated quite a lot against the US dollar during the last few years, right? And perhaps prior to the RMB joining the SDR. So you have a little bit what we call catch up to do in terms of US dollar RMB exchange rate. But once we've done with it, the rate, when measured against a basket of currencies, would be quite stable. And there's really no basis for China to depreciate the currency, because if you look at our fundamentals of the economy, we still have a very sizable current account surplus, right? The economy is growing at about 6.5%. These are not a combination for a deep depreciation of the currency. And no matter what, depreciation of the currency is not in the interest of China in terms of carrying out our transition strategy, right? Because too cheap currency is not for good for domestic consumption. And we thank the IMF for working to admit the RMB into the SDR. Some people worry that once China enters into the SDR, it may not fulfill all the commitment with respect to joining the SDR. I can assure you that worry is completely unnecessary. China's record of honoring international commitment is superb, and we intended to honor all the commitments with regard to joining the SDR. So that's the issue on currency. Very briefly on debt and financial, the dreaded word crisis. You will see volatilities in Chinese market going forward. But can the government deal with it? I think we will. We are able to deal with it. We can, because our structure of the government is such that the response to any financial risk is very swift. The decision is decisive, and we want to make sure that we deal with the issues when the issues are not very big, right? And again, it always comes down to leadership. When you have steady, strong leadership, we will be able to deal with it. Will there be volatilities? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of things that I would like to mention in response to your points. In a way, having a certain degree of volatility is all right, and it's compatible with this market-driven principles that China is adhering to. And when you say governments can manage volatility, if volatility becomes excessive, yes, intervening is legitimate. But a degree of volatility is okay, as Gary mentioned earlier. Market sorts out things eventually. Not that it's primus inter pares, but there should be at least an acceptance of the fact that there will be some, and there should be some. The second point in relation to exchange rate and the currency, I think you're completely right, and I think that this illusionary pegging against the dollar has to be dismissed. There is a basket of currency. In effective term, the renminbi has been quite stable against that basket of currency, and not just now, but for the last few months. And that should be just acknowledged, understood by markets, and this complaint that there is depreciation against one currency. No, you're doing that against a basket of currency which includes the trading partners of China. So, yes. And again, communication on that one I think is an important point.
So I just wanted to remind everyone that China's built its massive reserve not because of monetary policy, because of the last 30 years of incredible reforms, and is really driven by the incredible entrepreneurship and largely driven by private sector. So I think the government's commitment to continuous reform and continuously to support the private sector is important. Now, as Mr. Fang is here, I'd like to just remind you that the promise of the fourth board of a NASDAQ style of a stock exchange that would enable the small to medium-sized enterprises to be listed to get funding without producing profit. Because a lot of the companies listed on NASDAQ are not producing profit, remember. And today in China, if you are a Amazon, and if you do not, you can be as good as Amazon, but if you do not produce profit, you are not qualified to be listed. Now that commitment has to be, kept. And I think that was, the government came out, the policymakers talk a lot about the fourth board is going to come out. We'd love to see it coming out as promised, probably the fourth quarter of this year. I have a company, I needed to float it, and I'm expecting you to come out with the good news.
There you go.
I hear it.
Quickly, back to the currencies. Chairman Jan, and then Gary, I'll ask you the same question. Have Chinese policymakers actually done enough to reverse this market consensus that the yuan will devaluate?
这个根本的决定一个货币、决定一个汇率的，我觉得关键是经济的基本面啊。所以呢，如果中国的经济基本面仍然是世界经济的引擎，依然中国的经济的增长远远高于全球的增长啊。那个国际货币基金组织已经对明年的全球经济的这个做了个预测，平均增长3.4%。所以呢，我想呢，中国的经济运行依然相比全球来说，依然是高位运行，这就是汇率的一个决定的一个根本的一个依据。所以呢，从这一点来说，我觉得中国的汇率它这个基本面保持在一个合理均衡水平上的一种基本稳定，我认为是确定的。当然了，就是对中国这个汇率的这个形成机制产生了一些变化，就是当然时间很短，我们才加入了 SDR， 是吧？中国人民银行马上就宣布了，我们要跟一篮子货币，不再像过去这样盯着美元啊，我们要盯着一篮子货币。 这个呢，我觉得对中国很多人都还不完全理解，或者对信息还掌握还不够充分，对全世界更是如此。所以在这样的情况下面，我想呢，很多人的惯性，他还是以人民币盯美元来做他这个汇率形成的判断的。这也是我觉得最近一段时间人民币有些波动的一些原因之一。当然了，我们也看到了，就是美元加息以后的这个溢出效应不仅对中国、对新兴市场汇率的这一种影响，但是呢，我觉得这一种溢出效应可能未来也会带来回溢的效应的，因为现在各国的大家可以看到，不仅是大宗商品价行，这个汇率下行，一定程度上可能各国的外汇储备也在下行。这样外汇储备下行的结果，可能会推动美元的中长期的这个国债的这个价格，这样又带来的一个新的一个全球的一个在金融方面的，包括对美国的经济复苏和金融方面的一些问题。所以我想呢，最后经济还会平衡的。所以怎么样能够尽快让这个汇率能够稳定下来，我想还有加强投资者的教育和沟通，我觉得是非常重要的。但我也觉得，就是我非常将来同意了嘎嘎女士刚才说的这个中央银行它的基本点，它是要依靠市场机制来推动汇率的形成。这一点，我觉得中国是坚定不移的要这样走的。特别是加入 SDR 以后，我想都是推动了人民币的汇率形成的市场化。但是呢，另外一方面，如果市场有过度的波动或者不理性的波动，中央银行露出它的牙齿和它的爪子来，我觉得也是应该的。
So let me back up for 30 seconds and recount where we were a year ago. A year ago, we were in an economic situation where there were three currencies in the world that were willing to strengthen while the rest of the world was weakening. We had the Swiss franc, we had the RMB, we had the dollar. Literally a year ago, the Swiss National Bank decided that was not in their best interest. I think it was 52 weeks ago now that they decided that was not in their best interest. So they no longer were in that basket of currencies that was willing to be strong. Left the dollar and left the RMB. So if you see where the world was through the end of 2015, 2016, you had a world of devaluers, economies trying to lower interest rate, devalue their currency, grow at the expense of other economies. And the two currencies that were willing to rally were the dollar and China and the RMB. Now they were linked to each other. It would make sense to me that if you were linked to a currency that's naturally rallying, because you're the one not lowering your interest rates, that you would decouple from that currency and become more competitive in the currency world, which is exactly what China's doing. Makes total rational sense to me. Most market participants continue to believe that China will devalue their currency further. This is one of the areas of volatility. How will the devaluation go? Will it be very, very, very slow? Which I think most of us think it will be very slow and very methodical and take a long period of time. It will not be the Swiss National Bank, move the peg one night. But I think that the vast majority of market participants in their global equation of how they value economies and how they value currency crosses would have China at a lower value currency by the end of 2016 than the spot value is today.
Ray, how much do you worry about foreign exchange reserves? We understand figures that they dropped by $500 billion last year. At what point does it become dangerous and actually self-inflict a confidence crisis?
Yeah. I think it's a big issue. The balance of payments imbalance is large, and as you're referring to, reflected in that. On the offshore rate in Hong Kong, the interest rate differentials are rising, so that's a negative for the economy, and an economy in which interest rates should be lowered. It's a situation in which, if you look at their past evaluations, roughly they've taken place between when there's a 10 to 30% decrease in reserves, there's been on average a 25% devaluation. That's been in the past. So I think that those are things to pay attention to. It's not always easy for governments to maintain clear control of their currency.
Madame Lagarde, onto another point, because we actually also have some news. The IMF opened its selection process for the managing director when your term ends in July. You've had the support of both France and the UK. Do you want a second term?
You will appreciate that I'll be waiting a little bit before I say anything about that. But thank you for the question.
If you do get a second term, how much do you think we'll be talking about China in the next 4 years?
Well, in the next few years, given the growth rate of that country and given the stage of development it is at, I think we'll be talking a lot about China. It is one of the two largest economies in the world. If you define in PPP terms, it is the largest economy in the world. So I think we would be crazy not to talk a lot about China. And the transformations that are at play at the moment are going to be both fascinating and will matter a lot for the rest of the world. We've seen it over the summer, surprise, surprise, but we're going to see it more going forward because there will be spillover effects in the vicinity because there is a China supply chain. We'll see it across the world as well. And any, significant reduction in the growth of the largest economy in the world or the second largest economy in the world, depending on how you calculate it, is obviously going to impact the rest of the global economy.
From 2010 to 2015, growth rate for China has fallen by 4 percentage points. Looking at 2020, what do you think, Mr. Wang, the growth rate will be?
Oh, okay. Now, okay, let me...
Before you answer that, if I
Go
may.
ahead.
It's fascinating. People say, China's growth has collapsed at 6.9%. Well, if you look at the output relative to what the output was back, sort of 6-7 years ago with a 12 or 13% growth rate, we have the same. So give us... No, sorry, I'll stop here.
No, I understand that there's some concern about this current year in China. Right? Some people forecast that because of the volatilities, right, and so forth, somehow 2016 would be a very bad year for China. Growth rate will slow down dramatically. I don't think that will happen because in China we cannot afford to let growth rate to drop too sharply because that will ignite a lot of financial problems inside China. So we will have what we call appropriately expansionary supportive fiscal and financial policy in this current year to make sure that growth rate is still appropriate. Now, does China have the means to do so? Obviously, we have the means to do so, particularly on the fiscal side, and we can expand quite a lot, right? So there's just no worry for a somehow sharp decline of China's growth rate. Now, some people think, well, your 6.9% is perhaps just not accurate to begin with, right? Now, I admit, our numbers can always be more perfect, more accurate, but let me give you a sort of supportive figure, and that is tax revenues in China last year went up by 6.6%. Right? So that's not very far away from the 6.9%. And which means that the figure is not far away from the truth. And Madam Lagarde also mentioned China's contributions to the rest of the world remains extremely large, which is true. I mean, if you talk to all these multinational company CEOs having business in China, most of them tell you that their business in China are still expanding quite well. Ford Motors, for example, right? Ford is not the biggest car seller in China, but they sold 1.07 million cars in China last year. 1.07 million. It's not a small number. So China remains a huge contribution to the rest of the world, and this is something that the rest of the world should appreciate a little bit more.
Zhang, and you were pointing to something that also a lot of observers do underestimate, which is the strength of consumer spending and it's the strength of services. How resilient are those two when you look at the Chinese economy?
What I think the dynamic force for the Chinese economy is its entrepreneurialism and its private sector, and especially the small to medium-sized companies, not the gigantic SOEs, or even though they command a lot of power, but it is the millions and millions of SOEs that matter the most. And I think in that regard, the reforms still need to be more focused on giving them the support, whether it's a capital market support or tax support, monetary support. Those are very important for the continuous growth, because that will continue to be the growth engine for China. And now from where I sit, I see incredible innovation coming from the young internet, mobile companies. And that really is an exciting part of our economy that very rarely it gets featured into the news, because we talk so much about the market volatility and so on. In fact, most of these SOEs don't even get a chance to participate in the volatility. I think it's important that we remember that, especially the policymakers like Mr. Fan, and important to include these SMEs, and they would reduce your volatility.
Mr. Fang, a comment? You take.
I agree that the the SMEs are a great contributor to Chinese growth. Our stock market should have done a lot more to support growth. It is doing quite a lot, by the way. I mean, just take last year, right? People focused so much on the sort of the gyrations in the stock market last year. But last year, the Chinese stock market raised 1.4 trillion RMB in equity money for the Chinese companies. That placed the Chinese stock market #1 in the world in terms of equity raised. But we can certainly do much better. And just one very short sentence about financial risk. China is different from other developing countries in the sense our growth is largely fueled by domestic savings, by domestic capital. That gave us a confidence in our ability to deal with whatever volatilities, risks coming out of the financial market. If China was a country relying largely on foreign capital for growth, you bet any major financial risk can derail our growth. But China is different. Now, this is a fact that a lot of people should pay attention to.
Chairman Zhang, how inclusive will China's growth be in the future?
我想谈2个方面吧。一个接着这个张欣女士刚才讲的中小企业的问题啊，我想呢，关注中小企业的成长，对中国尤为重要。因为中小企业充满了巨大的这个增长的这个潜力和活力，而且它是解决就业的一个最重要的一个方面。去年中国经济结构有了比较大的调整，但是大家看到就是就业的状况非常好，而且比年初预计的结果还是超额完成的，保证了中国经济能够顺利的进行结构调整和改革。当然了，这个在支持中小企业的方面，刚才张欣女士实际上也批评了这个中国的金融这个领域。当然，我想我作为一个银行领域这个工作者，对中小企业的这方面的信贷的支持，我觉得是体现包容性的一个非常重要的方面。我们到去年大概工商银行的资产负债表上有1.8万亿人民币的贷款余额是支持中小企业的。当然，我们还应该做得更好。希望以后张欣女士有需求的话，可以跟我提出啊。第二呢，就是我觉得呢，这个经济增长的包容性还有一个方面，就是一个环境保护和绿色信贷啊。当然，我们在这个方面，我们已经做了很多的工作。中国的这个金融业在绿色信贷方面，我们是态度非常坚决的。任何如果是跟环保不符合的， 当然，我们是以环保部门的他们的评价是为我们的标准的。任何的企业只要环保不符合，我们坚决的否定。所以呢，我想呢，我们需要的是更加包容的成长，我们需要一个更加美好的一个世界啊，是这样哈。我们中国的经济的发展，我想我们就能够取得一个将来更好的一个人们更欢迎的这么一个效果。
Right, following on from that, with global trade stagnant, when or will China take the role that the US has had for years in spurring demand?
I don't think we're going to see that for 3 years or more. We're going to see China's going through this adjustment process, and it'll be, I think, a 3-year type of adjustment process. It's the equivalent, a lot of these structural things. So it's going to be a negative on the margin, a negative for world economy. And that passes through to emerging countries, particularly those that have a dependence on exports to China or have commodities. And then that is passing through in turn to a number of countries. So there's a world deflationary pressure that exists. And that's why when we think about the Fed's policies, there's not a country in the world that should not ease its monetary policies. Maybe some should stay pat, maybe the UK should stay pat, maybe. But by and large, we have that self-reinforcing negative circumstance in terms of growth that is a problem because the rest of the world also represents a weakening in force for China, for the exports, for their demand. That is also weakening. So I don't think that I think the question will be, where is the locomotive?
Where is it, and what does it mean for Fed policy? If you look at these deflationary pressures coming from a possible yuan devaluation from oil, how does Janet Yellen look at this?
I think the Federal Reserve thinks of the business cycle. A classic business cycle is that when your demand is increasing faster than your capacity, and you're at a fairly high level of capacity, unemployment rates are low, GDP gap is fairly tight, you should tighten monetary policy. And that's the policy, I think, that's overriding the Fed's issue. I think they're paying too much attention to the business cycle and not enough attention to the long-term debt cycle. There is a long-term debt cycle that you can't squeeze much more out of this because of the lower interest rates and that. And so we're seeing that the world that they're getting feedback about is a deflating world with asset prices coming down. And I hope that they'll remain flexible in their thinking of monetary policy. Be hesitant. There's asymmetric risks because there's no doubt that the Federal Reserve can be effective in tightening monetary policy. So if they're a little bit late and then they tighten monetary policy, I don't think that's a problem. But they're not as effective in easing monetary policy. The pushing on a string, like in the 1935 period, is a real issue. And so what they have to do is more wait for the whites of the eyes of inflation before they err on that. Because I don't think it's going to be so easy to be stimulative and move to quantitative easing and create that reversal.
Gary, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think that, one of the new paradigms, again, going back to this digital world we live in versus the analog world, a lot of the Fed policy that we're relying upon is analog policy. I mean, it's the same policy we've had for generations and generations and generations. The world we live in today is completely digitized, meaning that we're real time. We've got a global workforce today. We've got global free movement of currency. Anyone with a handheld digital device, one of those, can move any amount of currency they want around the world, can trade any bond they want around the world. So, fixating on employment in the United States is interesting, but we've been unable to create wage inflation now for multiple years, where the Fed has told us multiple times that it will come. Every year it will come. But in some respects, when you think of a globalized workforce today, which I think we have a globalized workforce, and China is part of our globalized workforce, if you can go hire the incremental worker for less money in China than you can in the United States, where does the wage price inflation come from? And I think we're seeing that in the numbers. We see that we can create jobs in the United States, but we can't create jobs that pay real money. And you take most companies that we represent are clients of ours, and we talk to them about how they're running their company, they will talk to me or they will talk to our representatives about how they're optimizing their workforce, how they're moving jobs to Bangalore, how they're moving jobs and opportunities to China, how they're moving jobs or opportunities to Warsaw, Poland, because these are places where they can hire workers at huge discounts relative to a London, a Hong Kong, a New York. And so therefore, to the extent that they would have to pay incrementally more for the next worker, they'll export the job. And so I agree with Ray. Until you see the reality of this inflation in the system, I'm not sure assuming it's coming is a good assumption.
We're almost running out of time, so I'm just going to ask each of you to give me your best advice or best prescription to try and bridge the divide that we were talking about between making market perception and what the policymakers in China want. Chairman Zhang.
这个一个呢，希望这个世界的经济会变得越来越好啊，希望这个我们这种这个剧烈的波动，市场的剧烈的波动，会尽快的会缩小它的波动啊。这个同时呢，我也希望啊，中国呢能够这个顺利的实施我们的结构的改革，这个调整啊，能够顺利的跨过这个中等收入的陷阱。
Thank you. Madame Lagarde?
I would say number one, clarity of communication. I would say number two, clarity of purpose. And I would say number three, implementation of the reforms that have been identified. And for all of us, a bit of patience with a massive undertaking.
Madame Lagarde, Germany has also just backed you for a second term. So can you say a comment that you would at least consider it? I'm getting breaking news.
Look, I'm honored. I'm very grateful, and I'm extremely, pleased to hear that. And I thank you. I thank those who have come out like that. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Feinfuel.
Ray just said that China is, on the margin, a negative contributor to world growth. I was thinking, who in your mind would be a positive contributor on the margin to world growth?
Just to be clear, what I'm saying is that as the rate of growth slows and the complexion of the economy changes,
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. On the margin, that's a negative to growth. I don't think right now, I don't think that we have a locomotive. I think that with the exchange rate rising in the United States, and also with the negative wealth effect that we're going to have because of the stock market going down, that we're going to, even in the United States, experience a lower level of growth. My concern is that we don't have a locomotive.
That's what I wanted to say as well. In this world, in fact, we have to, all the major countries, right, major economies, perhaps simply have to work together a lot more and cooperate a lot more in terms of policies, understand each other a lot more in terms of overcoming our respective domestic difficulties, and realize that the economy is globalized, we are all on the same boat, and we just have to cooperate a lot more closely to overcome this soft patch going forward.
And just to follow through of that, would that be monetary policy cooperation? Would that be fiscal policy cooperation? In what form will that cooperation take?
All of that. Madam just told me.
It'll be a challenge.
It is. But, just to add one sentence that is, in terms of U.S.-China cooperations, in monetary policy and other issues, we are working very well with our U.S. counterparts.
Right, a challenge but doable. You're confident this will be done?
I think monetary policies is not going to be as effective. That's a big change in the world because we've required monetary policies to be effective. And then I think on cooperation on monetary policies, I think that because you can't move interest rates as much, you move currencies more. So I think that we're entering an environment in which there will be more currency volatility as a means of easing policies where they need to be eased. And that smacks of currency wars, not as much currency cooperation. When I think of fiscal policy, I think fiscal policy is very politically sensitive. You know, you get into a bad economic situation and somebody will say you need to be fiscally more responsible and cut, and someone will say you need fiscal stimulus. And when there's political shifts, that, and particularly, let's say, the populism that's taking place in Europe or even in the United States, those things may not be easy decisions to make on fiscal policy.
Gary, in 20 seconds.
So I agree with Chairman Jane. I hope for China's success very much. I agree with Madame Lagarde. We all want clarity. I agree with the chairman's here that we're hoping for success in all the policy areas. The one area where I would just throw my 2 cents in is China seems to be more receptive, in your point, to more trade policies. And getting some of the trade policies done with the United States would be very beneficial for both in growing both economies.
Zhang Xing, final words, 20 seconds.
I think that China is going through this transition period, and there's going to be a lot of volatility and noise. And it's important that the policymakers and the media are not focused only on the short-term noise, but committed to the long-term reforms.
Thank you.